Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. My name is Stephanie Small, and I'm a product coordinator here at BookNet. Welcome to Canadian Book Publishing Insights from the latest salary survey. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote, and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose lands that you're joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping, and anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities and all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. For our webinar today, if you're having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put them in the chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, you can find the Show Captions button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please be kind and respectful, and please do not record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy for violations of our Code of Conduct, so please report any harassment to the Tech Forum team. So now let me introduce Dawn Gorman, our moderator for today's session. Dawn is the publisher at Rocky Mountain Books, as well as the National Sales Director at Heritage Group Distribution. A 1992 graduate of the University of Victoria, he has spent over 30 years in the book trade, 20 of them at Rocky Mountain Books, working as a bookseller, a publisher's sales representative, and acquisitions editor. Along with his publishing and sales responsibilities, he's regularly collaborating with other publishers and sales representatives on key industry issues, including advocacy, distribution, marketing, metadata, project management, and sales strategies. He has served on the boards of the Association of Canadian Publishers, the Book Publishers Association of Alberta, and Pub West. Dawn is a member of the College of Fellows of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and is currently the president of the Association of Book Publishers of British Columbia. He lives and works in Victoria, BC. So I'm going to leave it over to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome everybody. I really appreciate seeing so many people taking part in today's session. I think we have 56 attendees and 12 panelists. So well done. This is clearly a topic that people are very interested in. One note as we get going and a reminder, especially in terms of the interpreters, if you are speaking, please speak as naturally as you possibly can, not too fast, not too slow. That will help the interpreters actually assign the proper ASL to everything that's being spoken about. And I thank them very much for taking part in today's session. And thank you to everybody at the ACP, BookNet, and Tech Forum for setting this up. As mentioned, I'm Don Gorman, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm calling in from Victoria, BC, on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt and Songhees, Malahat, Pichadalat, Sienanu, Suk, and Wasanic peoples. Here's what you can expect from today's event. First, Danny McDonald, Research and Communications Manager at the Association of Canadian Publishers, will share insights and key takeaways from the results of the Canadian book publishing industry salary survey. Then Fong Trong, co-publisher at Second Story Press, and Ruth Linka, publisher at Orca Book Publishers, will join us for a conversation where together we will discuss what the survey findings mean in the context of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the industry. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. While audience questions will be addressed at the end, you may submit them anytime using the Q&A box located on your Zoom screen. And with that, Danny, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Don. And apologies in advance if my cat jumps up on my desk. He's already tried twice. I think he's given up now, but we will see. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. Like Don mentioned, my name is Danny McDonald. I'm the Research and Communications Manager at the Association of Canadian Publishers. And I'm really happy to be here today to present the findings from our 2024 Canadian Book Publishing Industry Salary Survey, which was conducted by ACP in partnership with Working Culture. And I'd like just to start by saying that I'm calling in from Ottawa, which is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. So we're here today to talk about money, and that can be sometimes an awkward or a little bit of a sensitive topic, but I think it's an absolutely essential part of our working lives. And in talking about money and average wages across the industry, we're also going to be talking about equity, representation, sustainability, and also the future of our industry as a whole. Because I think understanding how compensation works and maybe how it doesn't work in our field can ultimately help us build a stronger and more inclusive publishing sector in Canada. So as mentioned, I'm going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so just running through the results of the survey. And then we're going to move into more of a panel discussion on what the results mean for our industry as a whole. And I will mention, I can't see the participants, but I think maybe that Andrew Martin is in the crowd. And he was our consultant who actually worked on drafting the report and analyzing the data. So if during the Q&A portion, there's a bit more technical questions or specific to data analysis questions, I may just turn the mic over to him for that. And before we begin, I will mention that the link to the full salary survey report should be in the chat or will be in the chat soon. And we're also going to be sharing a link to our simplified one-pager that just includes salary data and demographic information. And I will say as well that I won't be sharing any graphs on my slides, just because I find they're often hard to read on Zoom anyway. But you are free to follow along in the report where there's no shortage of graphs if you'd like that visual element as well. Okay, so why this survey now? I'll give just a little bit of background on how the survey came to be. So the last comprehensive salary survey for our industry was done back in 2018 by Quill and Quire. And that was over 6 years ago now. So before the pandemic, before the big paradigm shift from working mostly in office to changes to working from home and hybrid work models, and also, of course, before the very sharp rise in inflation in the past few years that's really affected everyone and every industry in our country. So when it became clear that Quill and Choir probably wouldn't be conducting another survey, we had a lot of requests from our membership to take on that project ourselves. Particularly conducting a salary survey was really a priority for our diversity and inclusion committee, as we see wage transparency definitely as a distinct DEI issue. And we also found that in our 2022 diversity baseline survey, data pointed towards low salaries and a lack of pay transparency as being major barriers to inclusion in publishing. In that survey, we had about 20% of respondents specifically writing in saying that better salaries and more transparency are key steps towards change. And I will note as well that the 2022 diversity baseline survey that I'm going to bring up a few times in this presentation, it did ask some questions about compensation. So you may notice in the report itself, there are some charts that have comparisons to the 2022 data as well as the 2018 data from Quill and Choir. And the salary questions that were asked in the 2022 survey only really asked about ranges, and they didn't ask for specific job titles, so it's not as granular as either of the two salary surveys. So the comparisons that we could make between the 2024 and 2022 data are a bit limited, as you can see in the report. And I will note as well that as a first step towards more salary transparency, last year ACP made it a requirement that any job postings shared in our update newsletter included a salary range. And that was a good first step, but we knew that in order to get a clear picture of wages across the industry, we'd need to conduct this full survey as well. So I think it's safe to say that the 2024 survey comes at a really critical time for our industry. And I'm hopeful that the data that I'm presenting today and that's available in the report will help us understand where we've improved in some areas, maybe where we've stalled, and also what work just still needs to be done. Okay, so I'm going to just talk a moment about methodology. The survey was open from September 9th to November 25th, 2024. It received 779 responses from people working in publishing across Canada. And to give a little bit of context to that number, in 2023, Nordicity did a study where they reported there were likely around 5,000 full-time equivalent employees directly employed by publishers in Canada, with the industry as a whole supporting the employment of around 8,700 full-time equivalents, which would be in publishing and also related industries in the supply chain. So with that, we can say that the 779 people who filled out the survey probably reflects somewhere between 9% and 16% of the industry, just depending on how you slice it. And of those 779 people who filled out the survey, 591 provided salary data. So some people had incomplete surveys or only answered the demographic sections, but the 591 was still more than double than the respondents to the 2018 salary survey who provided salary data. And the survey, it was also anonymous, voluntary, self-reported. Participation was encouraged across a wide range of roles, from full-time, part-time, contract workers, freelancers, and interns as well. I will note that because of the way that the survey was set up, and specifically looking to find average annual salaries, it did make it a bit more difficult for freelancers and contract workers to provide meaningful data. While we did offer a spot in the survey to input hourly wage information, many freelancers, they may work at multiple publishers. In the case of more generalized roles, they may get some of their annual wages from industries outside of publishing altogether. And because of this, it was a little bit difficult to translate those hourly wages into annual salaries, which is how they were presented in the report. But I think as the gig economy becomes a lot more entrenched, and there are fewer and fewer full-time permanent positions, we need to think about in the future how we can perhaps change the survey and ask different questions so this data better reflects all of the different people who work in publishing and make publishing a book in Canada possible. So the 2024 survey, it addresses two things, compensation and industry demographics. And it does so in the context of those two previous surveys that I've mentioned. So the 2018 Quill and Quire survey and the 2022 diversity baseline survey that ACP conducted. And bundling the data from all these surveys is a bit challenging. The three surveys, they're not identical in scope or the specific questions asked. They're spaced before, during, and after the pandemic, and the participation rates for all of them were different. Importantly, the 2024 survey, we tried to capture more demographic information than the 2018 survey, asking questions about things like gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, race, age, and more. And this was because we wanted to be able to cross-reference compensation with those pieces of identity data, because we saw it as really essential for analyzing equity in the industry. However, adding these additional questions and adding additional answer choices meant that one-to-one comparisons couldn't always be made to the 2018 data, which you might notice in some of the charts in the report. Okay, so before diving into the salary numbers, I'm going to just give a little snapshot of who makes up the publishing industry. So for gender, we have 79% women, 15% men, and 4% identifying as non-binary or gender non-conforming. For race, we had 79% identifying as white in 2024, which is a bit more diverse compared to the 87% that identified as white in 2018, but is actually down slightly from 75% white in 2022. For sexual orientation, only 61% identified as heterosexual in the 2024 survey, which definitely shows a growing LGBTQ plus visibility in the workforce. In comparison, only 13% identified as LGBTQ plus in the 2018 survey. For disability, we found that 19% of respondents reported having a disability, which is up quite a bit from 3% in 2018, but actually down from 26% in 2022. And for age, in 2018, we had 38 respondents who reported being under 30, and today that number is only 20%. And we reported that nearly 23%, almost a quarter, are over 50 in 2024. So what these numbers tell us is that Canadian publishing, it is becoming more diverse in some areas, but also a bit more entrenched and less accessible for newcomers in other areas. And we'll go back to these demographic points as we dig deeper into the salary data as well. So the good news is that salaries are rising. Across the board, the average salary in publishing in 2024 was around $64,580. And that's up from about $50,000 in 2018, which is a 30% increase over 6 years. This is definitely a meaningful jump as inflation has only increased, well, not only, but has increased 23% since 2018. So salaries have outpaced inflation when looking at those numbers. And I've just included a few examples of roles from the survey. And if you'd like to look at a specific role, you can open up the full report. But for now, I'll just share that publishers or VP publishing at Canadian-owned firms saw an average salary of around $88K, which was up from around $60K in 2018. Acquisitions editors saw an average salary of around $64,600, up from around $56K in 2018. And one of the only positions to see a decrease was sales directors, which actually dropped from 89K in 2018 to 77K in 2024. This discrepancy, it's most likely to do with kind of a wider range of responses that we received and just a larger number of responses in 2024, which likely means that more smaller presses were represented in the respondents who might have lower salaries on a whole. So all in all, it is a better paid industry. It has fewer low-paying jobs, especially post-pandemic. In 2024, there were 25% earning under 50K, while in 2022, that number was 36%. And also just looking at the low range of averages, some significant gains have been made as well. In the 2018 survey, the lowest average salary of any role was 30K, while the lowest average salary of any role in 2024 was around 39K. So while these increases may just reflect higher participation by people in higher paid jobs, I think taken as a whole, the data does suggest that salaries in book publishing are increasing. But gains are not consistent across all roles or all demographics, as we'll see later. Furthermore, the average salary in publishing is unsurprisingly lower than the average across other industries. According to StatsCan, the average annual salary in Canada across all industries in 2024 was 72,800 compared to our average of around 64,500. So that's approximately 11% lower than the national average. So one of the pieces of good news and one of the most striking changes in the 2024 survey was the gender pay gap. So in 2018, in the Quill Inquirer survey, women in publishing earned on average around 45K, while men earned around 60K, which is about a 25% gap, so definitely significant. And now in 2024, women earned around close to 65K on average, while men made slightly less at around 64K. So now, at least on an industry-wide level, according to this data, it seems we have achieved gender pay parity, which is definitely good news. But it's important to note that these are just averages and they don't specifically tell us about pay gaps within like specific roles or across different firms. And while there may have been meaningful pay increases for women in the past 6 years, the higher participation rate, especially around senior publishing and editorial positions, is probably a more likely explanation for the jump. Mindful that the average increase between 2018 and 2024 was approximately 30%, which is the same increase we saw specifically with women between 2018 and 2024. And I'll also note that we just didn't get enough data from non-binary or other gender non-conforming respondents to analyze those averages meaningfully against the salary data that we received. So unlike the 2018 survey, the 2024 version did include salary data disaggregated by race. And while we did provide many response choices like gender, the data was just too granular to place every racial identity against salary averages, especially since, as I previously mentioned, 79% of respondents did identify as white. But what we were able to analyze is that white respondents made on average around 66K, while BIPOC respondents made an average of 61,650. So that is around a $4,400 gap, or roughly a 7% difference. And because BIPOC respondents made up only around 20% of total responses, the data may be slightly skewed because of that smaller sample size. However, I think this gap likely points to some deeper systemic issues in the industry, underrepresentation of BIPOC folk in senior roles, having respondents come from smaller firms with tighter budgets who are perhaps unable to hire new staff, and other long-standing barriers to advancement for BIPOC people. So it's not a huge gap, but it's definitely significant, and I think it demands further attention from us at ACP, from publishers, and also from funders and policymakers alike. So moving on to geography, unsurprisingly, again, the majority of publishing professionals still live and work in Ontario, particularly in the GTA. So we found that 61% of respondents are Ontario-based, with around 40% of respondents living in the GTA. And while previously noted, average salaries have slightly outpaced inflation since 2018, rising on average around 30% compared to inflation's 23%. That definitely doesn't mean they have kept up with the cost of living. So according to a report by the Wesley Institute in 2024, a single working age adult in the GTA needed to make on average between 61K and 83K after taxes to live comfortably. And with average salaries from our report in publishing being around 64K before taxes, a publishing salary, unfortunately, in most cases, is not enough to live off of alone. So while our industry is certainly better paid than it was 6 years ago, it's safe to say that most wouldn't consider it well paid. And beyond the cost of living, I think the geographic concentration of jobs in publishing definitely has other implications. It reflects where our publishing jobs are, but it also reflects where they aren't. So if we want regional diversity in both our workforce and our stories, I think it's important that jobs become a bit more evenly distributed across the country. Okay, moving on to some employment trends and firm types. We found that most survey respondents work at Canadian-owned firms, so about 82% of the total. However, it's really important to note that that number definitely does not reflect the actual percentage of workers across the industry. Unfortunately, participation by multinational firms was quite disappointing for this survey. There seemed to be a bit of reluctance by a lot of these country or companies to advance information that might either identify respondents or maybe give a glimpse of a company's overall compensation levels. So most of the companies that employed survey respondents are small because most of them are Canadian owned. So we found that 58% employ 25 or fewer people, and nearly 40% reported annual revenues under $1 million. So to put things in perspective again, Nordicity reported in 2023 that 23% of full-time equivalents working in Canada worked at publishing firms with over 100 employees, while in our survey, we only reported around 16% working at companies with over 100 employees. So there's definitely a lack of responses from the larger companies operating in Canada, many of which would be multinational. Although definitely small presses are the backbone of Canadian publishing, they publish so much great Canadian literature. The reality is that a lot of them operate on very small margins, and that can limit their ability to raise salaries, to invest in training, or to even just hire new full-time staff. So while salaries are improving, there's definitely some structural financial constraints that remain. Another theme that emerged from the data is that the publishing workforce in Canada is definitely has stability or maybe stagnation, depending on how you look at it. So we found in the 2024 survey that 51% of respondents had been in publishing for 10 years or more. Only 20% are under 30, and many respondents have been at the same company for many years. This was actually quite a difference from 2018, where 38% of respondents were under 30. Furthermore, only 11% of respondents in 2018 said they were over 50, while nearly a quarter did in the 2024 survey. So it could be that older people are just getting newly hired, but what seems more likely is that the book publishing industry is fairly stable and just aging in place. And this has pros and cons. On the one hand, it seems like for the most part, there isn't high turnover at respondent firms, meaning that institutional memory is remaining strong. On the other hand, without fresh voices and diverse perspectives entering the industry, we do risk falling behind in some areas. So this piece of data definitely points towards things like succession planning, mentorship, and inclusive hiring practices being pretty crucial to increasing diversity at firms. So let's put that all together for some key takeaways. So firstly, salaries are increasing, especially in senior roles, but average salaries are still struggling to reach cost of living standards in the cities where most publishers are based. Gender parity has improved significantly, which is likely due to more women in senior roles and also just more respondents to the survey in general. Racial pay disparities still exist, which definitely highlights the need for continued action to address inequities in compensation. The workforce is older, a bit more entrenched, which does raise questions about entry points for new professionals, and also more existential questions about what the industry will look like once these older professionals who make up such a large proportion of the workforce have aged out of the workforce. And finally, Ontario remains the epicenter of Canadian publishing, which does, in some ways, limit access to jobs elsewhere in the country. So I think this data gives us a good snapshot of where we are, but just looking at what comes next and what next steps we can take. So depending on funding, we will likely conduct another salary survey probably in the next 5 years or so. And I think for that next survey, our most important task is to really increase survey participation, especially in underrepresented groups and also multinational firms, so we can have just a more accurate picture of the industry. And I think in the meantime, we can use the data we've gathered to help address these equity gaps. So specifically through companies conducting pay audits to see where their pay falls with the national averages, and also just fostering more salary transparency at work. I also think we can support early career professionals with fair pay, with mentorships, and also perhaps offering training outside of major cities where the cost of living is so high. And of course, ACP encourages everyone to use this data for advocacy. So whether that's conversations that we're having or our board are having with funding bodies in the government to increase funding for our industry, or just the conversations that employees may be having with their bosses or their HR representatives about their pay. So thank you for listening. That's all I have for presenting the data. A special thank you to everyone in the room who participated in the survey or helped share the survey. The data that you provided, I think, is truly valuable to understanding the current state of Canadian publishing, and also for working to improve conditions, not only for ourselves now, but also for future generations of publishing professionals. So I hope this data and this presentation helps spark conversation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that follows and any questions from the audience. So I think now I'll turn it back to Dawn to moderate.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Danny. That is an incredible amount of information. And I feel like we could probably go for another hour, 2 hours, parsing out some of that stuff. It's phenomenal. So thank you very much for your presentation. As a reminder to everybody, the panelists today are Tom Trong, co-publisher at Second Story Press, and Ruth Linka, the publisher at Orca Book Publishers. We have some questions that we're going to run through here. And then as mentioned earlier, we're going to stop the questions and move to a Q&A session with the audience. So please ensure that you are throwing your questions into the chat or the Q&A box, and we will do everything we can to get to those leading up to the end of today's session. So I'm going to start with the first question here. And honestly, listening to Danny, there were so many questions that were popping into my head that go beyond the scope and breadth of what we've already got here. So apologies to everybody if we don't cover everything. So the first question to the panel: how does your organization currently prioritize justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? And what strategies have worked best? And if it's okay, I'd like to start with Fong.
Thanks, Dawn. Well, diversity is one of the cornerstones of our mandate. So it really does benefit us to have that diversity reflected in our staff. And to that end, when we post for a job, we try to do it widely as possible. We post with the BIPOC of Publishing group. And then when we are assessing the resumes, we obviously choose the most qualified candidates, but often there are ways to see sometimes if an applicant belongs to one of these equity seeking groups. And even if their resume does not look quite as good, we will try to give them an interview as well, just to give them that extra opportunity and just even a chance at an interview is often helpful. Um, and then beyond that, all of our staff are involved in the editorial process. So we try to really hear what everyone has to say in regards to what we're producing.
Great, thank you, Fong. Ruth.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Fong has said. I don't know when exactly it started where it became clear that we could not produce certain books without having people involved in the publishing process, sales, marketing, who um, who had the right lens, were coming from a different perspective than what used to be still is a primarily settler white industry. So we started looking more purposefully for people like I don't even know at least a decade ago for people to hire. It's been a challenge, and I think that some of the publishing programs and the educational side of things, that's actually starting to help bring more diverse candidates into the pool of people we can hire. I don't want to focus too much on hiring, but I'll just say one more thing, which is the weirdly silver lining of COVID is that for a company so far out of the GTA, we became more adept and more willing, I guess, to work with people remotely. It presents its own set of challenges, but now more than half of our company doesn't work in our Victoria office. So that, in a sort of indirect way, has allowed us to hire from a broader group of people and more diverse people, even if it's just geographically, but it has been in all sorts of ways. So that's been like a sort of unexpected benefit of COVID changing the way our our physical office and not physical office has been expanding. So that's really focusing on the hiring stuff. Do you want us to also talk about day to day here in the office?
Well, actually, you know what? I think the hiring component is actually quite interesting because the first thing that popped into my head, and we certainly don't want to get bogged down in the hiring process, but I'm curious as to when you are putting out a call to hire, are either of you seeing more applications coming in from a diverse representation of candidates, or is it still a pretty white settler dominated raft of applicants coming in from across the country?
For us, it's still predominantly, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but for people who self-identify, it is still predominantly, white presenting or
Mhm.
physically able. I guess maybe, and this is reflected in the survey, there has been an uptick in LGBTQ applicants over the decade for sure, or 15 years. But yeah, it's still a struggle. And as Fong said, we definitely are trying to pull out any applicants who identify from an underrepresented category so that they're in the mix of sort of the short list that we're considering. We recently hired a nonfiction editor, and we had just over 200 applicants. And part of that was because we said it didn't have to be here in Victoria, so we've had applications from all over. So that was a huge job going through it. And even then, um, there weren't a lot of people from underrepresented categories.
Great, thank you, Fong. Are you seeing the same thing?
I think it depends really on, for us, the type of job. If it's an entry-level position, we tend to see a lot more diversity, because I think for the more senior roles, the people already in the industry are, as we know, predominantly white. But for those entry-level positions, there is a lot more diversity overall.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So moving on, what have been the key drivers of change in the pursuit of compensation equity at your firms? Can you share any examples of what's worked, or maybe more importantly, what hasn't worked? Fong, would you like to continue? Would that be okay?
Um, I think the most important thing for us is to have regular check-ins with our staff. So that really gives them an opportunity to let us know if something's not right, in terms of, their own job or just, their overall compensation, how they're feeling. So really, it's just important to keep kind of an open door policy and just make sure that people are feeling comfortable enough to speak their mind.
And Ruth?
Yeah, I think, an open and empathetic workplace is actually the first step to all good things,
Mhm.
including diversity. So I would agree with Fong on that. We have really strived to have that in ours. Um, in terms of like actually having like salaries go up, we've for well, maybe since COVID, really made it a priority to bring people at the lower end up to the point where directors and managers have not received increases or have received much smaller increases, so that we would focus our budget on bringing folks at the bottom up, trying to level things out more. And from what I can tell, everyone, including directors, are happy with this decision, and I think it has, fed back into that feeling of, that we're a team, and that we have to care about our coworkers, and just really um, understanding and emphasizing the value of each person in the company, regardless of what they do. Um, and to me, that is like foundational, and um, and feeds into a lot of things in the company that help us run a better company and make better books, frankly.
Great, thank you. You both touched on the notion of empathy coming from ownership, senior staff, and management in terms of being open and transparent in conversations with staff. I'm wondering, in terms of looking at the other side, so how might salary data empower publishing professionals or those who want to get into publishing, especially those from marginalized communities? How would the data allow them to advocate for themselves? Because I think that is a really important component in this conversation, because I don't think we can rely on ownership, senior staff, or management to ensure that EDI is always adhered to. So the role of advocacy for individuals applying. do you think the sales data here is going to actually help, or the salary data is going to help empower people when they are applying for jobs and to speak up?
I think
Ruth?
yes. I mean, I think it's great to have this information widely available. I would disagree with you. I like to believe my colleagues are all keen to make sure there's pay equity in their companies. I don't know. I find that well, I hope that we're all striving to do better. Um, for sure that we've had people come, and listing the position with the pay range has been a really great change. Um, and it allows the conversation sort of to be upfront right away rather than this sort of secretive or whatever mysterious kind of part of the hiring process. So, that transparency I think is super important. In fact, at one point, I
Mhm.
think I wrote down on a sticky for myself that transparency equals better treatment or equal treatment for all. And I didn't even mean that in terms of salary. I meant it in terms of all sorts of things. But for sure, starting the conversation out when you join a new company or are interviewing and having that be upfront is um, I think really valuable. It also can provoke conversation about why certain positions are paid more than others, which forces management then to think about it or
Mhm.
justify it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fong. Any thoughts on
I would
advocacy?
agree with what Ruth said and add that I think that the addition of those salary ranges in job postings was a tremendous step towards transparency. And it gives, current employees the opportunity to see what the going rate is sometimes for a role and with all of the duties listed out, and they can compare and say, well, I'm doing the same kind of things, but I'm making, X amount of money. So it just gives everyone more information moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now, I am conscious of the time here. We're at 11:47. I'd like to get to the audience Q&A at 11:50. So I just want to touch on one thing that actually wasn't in the questions that we had previously supplied that came up in the survey was the notion of an aging workforce in publishing. And I think that is very obvious given that a majority of the people in positions of power, I think, were over 50 years old. And I'm wondering what either of you think that actually means in terms of what's going on in Canadian publishing. Is that because retirement is probably not an option, or are people holding on to positions of perceived power simply because it's a great job, or they don't have a succession plan?
I don't have like stats to back this up, but from when I started in the industry, it felt like the people, the owners and the most senior positions were held by people who were even older than 50, like 60 and
Mhm.
70 years old. It feels like that's actually come down a bit now and is spread sort of between 50 and up. So I don't know if that's just a feeling I have, but um, I think what you said, I think it's all of those things. I think
Mhm.
people don't want to retire. I think people don't know how to pass their companies along. I think succession is like a whole separate topic we could spend 2 hours on, and how that's not working very well. Fong, of course, being a great example of how it is. Um,
Mhm.
but also as someone in a senior role in my 50s is looking at the workforce and thinking, well, who are the people that want to move up? Who are the people that are going to come? They have not clearly identified themselves to me yet. It's not a clear path yet for those of us who might want to retire in 10 or 15 years. there is no clear way that that's going to happen, both in terms of the people, but also in terms of the finances. So yeah, it's a problem.
Great, Fong, any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. All of the above for sure. Um, and I think that, well, I hope that, as some of the older staff kind of decide to retire, that we'll see that pay gap um, between the BIPOC employees and the non-BIPOC starts to close, because there's
Mhm.
currently just not any room for anyone to move up, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as well, I think the notion of 50 being part of this data set, that actually needs to shift. That seems like a dated sort of number. I don't want to suggest that 60 is the new 50 or vice versa, but I think 50 is pretty young to set a bar in terms of an age gap. So I would propose that maybe the future survey should look at 60 plus, which means that when the next survey is done, I will be in the 60 plus category, which that's not great. But anyway, thank you very much for going through these questions. I'd love to open it up now to questions from the audience. So the first question here is, why wait for approximately 5 years for the next survey instead of doing this yearly?
I can
So
answer that.
yeah, thank you,
The
Danny.
funding
Sorry. Yeah.
issue, mostly a money issue, ironically. We could do it potentially more often. I threw 5 years out because that's usually when we do our diversity baseline survey. So I saw them kind of going in tandem that way. But a lot of the grants that we're applying to do the research only allow you to get one grant within a 2 or 3 year period. So we would have to wait for that unless we could find funding from somewhere else. But it's definitely something to discuss. I don't think we'd be doing it yearly, but maybe 3 years would be a better gap if we're looking to get that data more quickly.
Great, thank you. Another question in terms of the survey itself. Do your findings only apply to full-time workers, or do you account for part-time or 4 day per week workers and remote versus in office?
Yeah, so in terms of full-time versus part-time, we did within the questions have people select whether they were full-time or part-time or contract. And if they were part-time, we asked them to put their hours per week and the wage they got, whether it was hourly or salaried. However, I will say that just in terms of numbers, it was 81% who answered the survey were full-time employees. So that was definitely accounted for most of the respondents. And for those respondents who weren't full-time, we just calculated out on average what their salary would be against a full-time if they had worked full-time hours, which isn't perfect just because, especially with freelancers who made up a pretty small percentage of survey respondents, their salaries might be or their wages might be a little bit higher because they're not getting a stable work. But for the most part, these are for full-time 5 day of work or 5 days per week work. But that would be an interesting, I see that Karen asked about remote versus in office. We didn't specifically ask questions about that, so we can't put those against salary data. We did in our last diversity baseline survey ask about whether people were hybrid, remote, or fully in office. So there's some data just on the demographics there. But I think that would be interesting. It would depend in terms of salary, I think. Like someone working remotely who perhaps maybe would have had to work in Toronto otherwise. But if it's remote and you would have been working somewhere with a lower cost of living anyways, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. But that would be interesting for the next survey for sure.
Great, thank you. And we do have a number of questions actually related to retirement plans. So the first one is, for the next survey, can you also ask things like, do you plan to retire in the next 5 years? And do you hope to stay in the publishing industry long term? As well as the older workers retire, how can publishers encouraging young people to stay or even enter the industry when the salaries are so far below the living wage. So the first question, can you include something like, do you plan to retire in the next 5 years in the
We
next
definitely
survey?
can. I'm trying to remember, I think in the diversity baseline, we didn't ask about retirement, but we did ask a question about, are you looking like, do you see yourself in the next 5 years continuing in publishing? So that was more like changing industries and less about retirement. But we do have some stats on that from the last survey. But that's definitely something to add. Something I will say we struggled with this survey is that the longer you make a survey, the less people you're going to have filling it out. And we really did want all this demographic information to disaggregate it against the salary data, because I think it's important to look at those equity benchmarks. But the more we put in, the more survey fatigue, and people are always filling out so many surveys as it is. So it is a little bit of a game of figuring out what the most important benchmarks are and making a survey that's accessible to everyone and not kind of overwhelming in that sense. But I do appreciate any feedback on the survey design. I'll definitely write it down, and when we do the next survey, I'll have all those points ready.
That's great. Thank you very much. This will probably be the last question here, and I'm going to throw this at the panelists. How can early career workers be given opportunities to gain relevant experience to move laterally in other publishing departments? Fong, since you're the first one on my screen there, would you mind?
That's a hard one. I think companies are constrained by their size. So I don't know that, like in our case, there would be a ton of room for an actual lateral move. Um, but we do, like I said, have everyone participate in like all parts of the process of producing the book. So in that sense, they are gaining experience. Whether or not we can accommodate a new role for them ourselves is hard to say.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Ruth, any thoughts on lateral moves?
Yeah, we do a lot of that. We often hire and think about how that person might expand as they get more training. And because we have a distribution and a customer service and a marketing team, there's lots of sort of junior or entry level roles. And we find that a lot of people have moved up from, whatever those junior roles are into other. And we like that because we want to keep that memory with us. So we're eager to move people around so they have that job satisfaction and learning opportunity. I just wanted to also just go back slightly, Dawn, to the other question about bringing new and young people into the industry. Um, and I just thought it'd be worth talking a little bit about the non-money compensation parts of publishing, the benefits that some companies can offer. We have an RSP program. A big reason why people can't retire out is because they don't have pensions. So we're hoping to sort of mitigate that for the folks who are starting out in publishing so that they're starting to build something now. But thinking about, the flexibility in the workplace and working remotely, those are all things that are hard to quantify, but I think, are markers of our industry. And of course, the great creative work, but trying to find other ways to bring flexibility and satisfaction to the jobs, I think is part of what we need to be doing more of as well.
Thank you. That's a really nice way to end this conversation on a positive note. So there are perks to being in publishing. It's a wonderful industry. I think a majority of us have been in it for decades and plan to stay by choice for as long as we possibly can. So thank you very much, Ruth and Fong, for taking part. And thank you, Danny, for all the information. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie for closing remarks. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Dawn, Danny, Fong, Ruth, for joining us today. Super insightful. Lots of great data to dive into. Before we let everyone go, we would love it if you could provide feedback on the session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat, so if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that out, that would be wonderful. We will also be emailing a link to the recording of this session as soon as it's available. To all of our attendees, we do invite you to join our upcoming session, Book Industry State of the Nation 2025, which is scheduled for June 26th. And lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And again, thanks to you all for attending.